At the end of the Second World War, there were a number of executions that were carried out to punish those men and women who worked as SS guards inside of concentration camps. Some executions, including those of the guards of Stutthof concentration camp, took place in public in front of crowds of 200,000 on a huge set of gallows. But there were many more SS men and women who were sentenced to death, and they were executed inside of execution chambers in various prisons around Germany. Executioners such as Albert Pierrepoint and John C. Woods would execute the most notorious and evil war criminals, but one man who was executed inside a British-controlled prison was Johann Schwarzhuber, a man who was during the Second World War working as one of the most senior figures inside of the all-female concentration camp Ravensbruck. This camp held women from many different countries, but the conditions there were very tough and brutal, but Schwarzhuber was later condemned for his crimes, as he was overseeing all of the women prisons there. Join us today as we look at the execution of the Commandant of the female concentration camp, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Johann Schwarzhuber was born on the 29th of August 1904 inside of a Bavarian town. He would have a rather normal upbringing, and then would train as a printer before he got married at the age of 32. He had 2 children, but at the time there was a growing Nazi movement which was emerging, and Hitler would then become Chancellor, and with this, Schwarzhuber joined the Nazi Party and the SS in 1933. He would not necessarily have a role in the Second World War as it broke out, but he was a man who would find work inside of the concentration camp system. He first went to Dachau, the earliest Nazi concentration camp, and he would work here as a block leader, and it was at Dachau where he first received his training alongside other SS men. Following a short stint there, Schwarzhuber was then transferred at the outbreak of the Second World War to Sachsenhausen. This was a huge site, where over 200,000 people were imprisoned throughout its time in operation, and it's believed that at least 50,000 people died at Sachsenhausen. There were a large number of subcamps that served the main camp, and Johann Schwarzhuber then worked as a commander of the Klinkerwerk subcamp, and he would preside over a number of prisoners each day. He was known for being a brutal man, but he would then, as September 1941 came around, be transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the main extermination element of the largest and deadliest concentration camp. Schwarzhuber was responsible there as a Lagerführer for many different blocks of prisoners, and he would on a daily basis beat and hit some of the inmates. He was known for being a man who was often drunk at Auschwitz, and he would also work alongside some of the capos to carry out the deadly operations of Auschwitz. But he was a guard who would get involved in the selections of prisoners who were sent to the gas chambers. He was in November 1943 promoted to become a Schutzhaftlagerführer, and because of this he was in control and charge of the whole of the men's camp, meaning it was he who would decide who was sent to the work camp and who was sent to their deaths. Inmates would get off the trains at Auschwitz, in the yards. They would then be separated into those who would go into the camp and work and those who would not. Schwarzhuber's decisions would send thousands to their deaths when they were loaded onto a number of trucks, which then drove the inmates straight to the gas chambers for their deaths. He was a man who would be responsible for hundreds of thousands of executions and exterminations, but he was a man who also was known for having been bribed or swayed in his decision-making. There were a number of examples of Johann Schwarzhuber taking prisoners out of the line from the gassing queue to have them placed in the regular men's prison camp, giving them, in a sense, a form of protection. It's not known why he did this on several occasions, but he was known for having a number of female mistresses at Auschwitz. One of these, it's believed, was Silke Klein, a woman who was 16 when she arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, but Schwarzhuber picked her to become his mistress, and her story would later become the inspiration for the book The Tattooist of Auschwitz. But he continued to work at Auschwitz, and it's clear that Heinrich Himmler thought a lot of Schwarzhuber, and he was then, in November 1944, sent to Dachau, where he was a commandant of a number of subcamps, but in January 1945, after being at the top of his own camps for some time, he was transferred to a final job at Ravensbruck concentration camp. This was an all-female concentration camp, which became known for its brutality and horror. Around 130,000 women would be imprisoned at the camp, and it's believed that between 30,000 to 90,000 women prisoners were killed inside of the barbed wire fences. The conditions at the camp got significantly worse as the war went on, and all of the women were forced to conduct back-breaking hard labour, and the women were not fed much at all. There was a huge shortage of food, and also disease spread quickly around Ravensbruck, but one inmate described the camp saying, "They didn't shoot the women, we were to die of misery, hunger and exhaustion." When we arrived at Ravensbruck, it was the worst. The first thing I saw was a cart with all the dead piled on it, their arms and legs hanging out, and mouths and eyes wide open. They reduced us to nothing. We didn't even feel like we had the value of cattle. You worked, and you died. The women suffered a lot at Ravensbruck, and they were subjected to assault, and also sick medical experiments at the hands of the evil SS guards and the doctors. But whilst here, Johann Schwarzhuber became the guard who was in charge for the women's camp. This meant that as almost all of the inmates were women, that Schwarzhuber was in command of the entire camp complex, and he was only answerable to the actual Commandant Fritz Sören, but he was more acting as a commandant on a daily basis. He was the second most senior figure, and the one the prisoners would see mostly every day. But when he got to Ravensbruck, it was a camp in a poor state, and it was very overcrowded, and food rations were very limited to begin with. In the winter of 1944, many of the prisoners had frozen to death due to poor clothing and heating in the barracks, and because of this, Schwarzhuber took brutal steps to try and prevent further overcrowding. Each day he would carry out the executions of around 50 women, which began as soon as he arrived there. Many of the former guards refused to oversee these executions, but Schwarzhuber took over in this. Ravensbruck would see a huge influx in deaths during his short time there, and thousands of women were also being gassed and killed inside of a new gas chamber that was made when Schwarzhuber arrived. He continued to be a brutal executioner inside of the all-female camp, but in April 1945 Ravensbruck was captured by the British Army, and he was then arrested and was held by the British. Following the end of the war, there were a number of war crimes trials that occurred that sought to punish those SS guards who worked inside of the concentration camps. One that took place was the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials, and defendant number 1 in the first set of trials was Johann Schwarzhuber. At the time, the main commandant Fritz Sören had fled, and Schwarzhuber was the most senior official who was indicted at the trial. He would plead not guilty to crimes against humanity, and said that the only killing he saw was one mass execution that occurred at Ravensbrück. He said he had looked on as 150 women were sent to the gas chamber and killed inside of it. But it was clear that he was sent to Ravensbrück to carry out mass execution, and he claimed that his bosses had told him to carry out any executions and that he was just following orders. But Schwarzhuber was in charge of the women's camp, and for this he was seen as a man who was responsible for the deaths of thousands, and he was found guilty and was sentenced to death. He was sent to Hamelin Prison to await his execution, and it would be notorious executioner Albert Pierrepoint who would take his life. He was on the 3rd of May 1947 brought out of his prison cell, as the day before Pierrepoint had met with Schwarzhuber and had taken his height and weight to calculate the drop needed to snap his neck instantly. He was then brought into the execution chamber, where a simultaneous gallows was found, and he was led up the stairs of the gallows, and then a cap was placed over his head. Pierrepoint checked his arms and legs and that they were secured, before the noose was placed over his head and he was shuffled over a chalk X on the trapdoor. Pierrepoint then released the trap, and Schwarzhuber plunged to his death. Johann Schwarzhuber was a man who was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, and inside of Ravensbrück he was an executioner and an assassin. He was responsible for the torture and evil treatment of different camps where he worked, but at the age of 42, the long-standing member of the SS and Nazi Party supporter would be executed by a British executioner inside of a German prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.